Hello, everyone. Welcome to McMenamins and Washington State Historical Society's virtual history pub. We're so thrilled to have you with us this evening. My name is Molly Wilmuth, and I'm lead program manager with Washington State Historical Society. And we are thrilled to be an ongoing partner with McMenamins. And for us, we're located in Tacoma, Washington. So we partner specifically with the McMenamins Elks Temple on this series with the McMenamins History Department. And it's been such a joy. This is our second year bringing you these programs. And obviously, this time around, it is virtual until we can all be together again, hopefully back at the Elks Temple in the amazing Spanish Ballroom. But thank you so much for joining us this evening. I want to first start off by acknowledging that the Washington State Historical Society is located on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people who have stewarded the land throughout the generations, and we pay our respect to their elders, both past and present. And before we get going, I want to plug a few upcoming things that we have going on with the Washington State Historical Society. So we have been hosting our Washington Stay Home Society programming series. So all of these virtual programs that you can view while we can't be over at the History Museum there in Tacoma. So you'll see that link right there. You can keep up on all of our virtual events in our programmatic series at that link right there. We'll take you to our brand new beautiful website, so you can check that out. And then also I would ask that you consider donating to help us continue our virtual programming during this time. If you really like the program, follow that link. You can donate and just in the notes section say that you came to a virtual history pub and you had a great time, and any amount helps, even if it's $5. Anything really does help. Make sure that we can continue bringing you this excellent programming that we have so much fun putting together for you. And then also, if you're just interested in becoming a member, that's the same link right there. Becoming a member ensures that you're supporting the Historical Society, and then you get perks like our Columbia magazine. That's a scholarly magazine that comes out quarterly. And then you'll also be kept up to date on any other kind of upcoming special membership programming or events. A couple of other upcoming things with the Washington State Historical Society I want to share. We are hosting still our 15th annual In the Spirit Contemporary Native Arts Exhibition. It's a juried arts exhibition that features our Native artists from across the Pacific Northwest, sometimes even further away. And we decided to go virtual to make sure that we were able to share all of their incredible artwork. It's online right now, and you can follow that link there at the bottom, www.inthespiritarts.org. And that will then take you to our virtual exhibition. Also, we are still collaborating with the Tacoma Arts Museum and Museum of Glass to ensure that we're still doing the Northwest Native Festival as well as the In the Spirit Virtual Arts Market. So it will all be online this year, which is actually kind of, more innovative and exciting for us. It makes it a little bit more dynamic. We have the possibility to actually show you artists and their work in their studios or when they go gathering their materials. So be sure to stay tuned. We're hoping that arts market and a whole host of programs will be happening from September 10th through October 17th. And you can find out more at that website listed there. And then something extra special that's happening this year is the Women's Suffrage Centennial for the entire nation. We were going to host a major event at the Washington State Capitol building, but unfortunately, we can't all be together. But fortunately, we're able to actually do something even more special than what we were planning in the first place, which is our Suffrage Special Whistle Stop Tour, which will be virtual programming for an entire week, August 19th through the 26th. And we'll be making stops across the state so you can actually learn about suffrage history all across the state of Washington. So be sure to check that out. You can follow us on social media to learn more about that. And then we also have all of that programming already listed on our Facebook page. But on to the main event. You are all here to learn about Eddie Bauer, the story of the person, as well as the 100 years that his company has been here in the Pacific Northwest. It's a really fascinating story. And before I introduce our speaker, I want to make sure to say we have our amazing program facilitator on the Facebook side of things that's going to be fielding all of your questions and then also adding all of those links for us, Len Bai. And if you have questions throughout the program, feel free to type them in the chat, and then those will come to us and we can ask those at the end of the presentation. So make sure that you're getting those questions in. But I would now like to introduce Colin Berg. So Colin Berg is the brand historian at Eddie Bauer, and he has held that position since 2007. Prior to that, he was on the company's writing staff from 1995 to 2004. And as the brand historian, he curates the company's archives and conducts tours. And he also continues to write and serves as the brand's storyteller, speaking both nationally and internationally. So we're so excited to have you join us, Colin. Thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you. So first of all, let me thank Molly and the Washington State Historical Society and McMinimans for inviting me to be part of History Pub, and to thank all of you who are joining us virtually. It's a real treat in these very strange times to connect in any way that's possible, and so technology has its advantages. So thank you all for being here. Let me take a moment and see if I can figure out how to share my screen here. There we go. So one of the fascinating things about history is that it can show us how deeply interconnected the events in our lives really are. And as an example of what I mean, in the winter of 1935, a fur trapper from Bristol Bay, Alaska, by the name of Red Carlson, decided that he wanted to spend some time in the balmier weather of Seattle. And he had in mind that he wanted to do some fishing with a friend of his, Eddie Bauer. So that January, Red and Eddie went over to the Olympic Peninsula to do some fishing for winter run steelhead on the North Fork of the Skokomish River. It was a cold and snowy day, but the fishing was good. And so after a few hours, the two of them had caught 100 pounds of steelhead. But now the hard part was how to get all that fish up the steep canyon that was now covered with snow to where their car was parked way up above. Well, they knew it was going to be a long, sweaty climb, and so they took off their heavy wool mackinaws, and Red took all their gear, including the mackinaws, and Eddie drew the short straw and had the 100 pounds of fish that he had to lug up the mountain. Since Red's, since Red's load was a lot lighter, he quickly outdistanced Eddie, reached the top, and started through the trees on his way to the car. Meanwhile, Eddie was laboring up, with all that fish. And in the process, his shirt got soaking wet from the fish, from the snow, from his sweat, from the labor, and all that moisture started to freeze. So by the time he got to the top of the canyon, not only was he exhausted, but his shirt was a solid sheet of ice. He stopped and leaned against a tree to rest and fell asleep, standing up. After a few seconds, he jerks awake and realizes that he's getting hypothermic, which is not a good thing in the middle of winter in the Pacific Northwest when you're outdoors. And Red was nowhere to be seen or heard, so Eddie pulls out his revolver and fires 3 warning shots and fell back to sleep. Well, Red hears the shots and hurries back and finds Eddie against the tree and gets him back to the car and back to town. But the truth is, if Eddie had been by himself, he very well might not have survived, in which case we wouldn't be here tonight talking about the Eddie Bauer story. But he was fortunate enough to have Red with him. And that life-threatening experience of Eddie's left him with 2 decisions, or had a decision to make. He either had to give up winter fishing, or he had to come up with a better winter jacket, something that was warm, but also much lighter weight than those wool mackinaws, and in some ways, even more important, highly breathable, so that you wouldn't get overheated during strenuous activity. Eddie decided to opt for that second option, and so let's see. He developed what he initially called the Blizzardproof Jacket. It later became known as the Skyliner Jacket. It was the first down jacket patented in the United States, and it revolutionized cold weather outerwear. But the fact is that it might not never have been created if Red hadn't decided to come to Seattle and if Eddie hadn't taken him fishing. Now, the first person that Eddie took his prototype of the Blizzardproof jacket to was another friend of his who was a mountaineer in Seattle called Omi Diber. And Omi was not only a mountaineer, but something of an inventor himself. He developed packs and sleeping bags and crampons and all manner of mountaineering gear. And so Eddie was particularly interested in what Omi would think of this new concept of down jacket that he had. So he takes the package to Omi and says, what do you think? And Omi tried it on and his face lit up and he thought it was the coolest thing since sliced bread, that something could be that lightweight and that warm. And having worked with down for sleeping bags, he knew that it was warm and highly breathable too. So he was so excited about it that he offered Eddie to manufacture it for him because he had a little factory that he made his mountaineering gear in. So that's what they did initially for the first year or so. Omi Diber was actually manufacturing the Eddie Bauer down jacket here in Seattle until Eddie got so many orders for it. He started advertising in Field and Stream and American Rifleman and those kinds of trade publications. And he got so many orders that Omi couldn't keep up with the volume. And so Eddie formed his own manufacturing arm called Arctic Feather and Down Company and continued to make the jackets here in Seattle. So he introduced the jacket in 1936. And in 1939, he submitted a patent application and the patent was issued in early 1940. And in addition to, as I said, revolutionizing cold weather outerwear, because really there was nothing in comparison to the down mackinaws and the wool shearling coats that they'd been using at the time. Down was like a quantum leap forward in lightweight warmth and breathable functionality. But in addition, it really marked the beginning of what has become a generational tradition at Eddie Bauer and what we call adventure-driven innovation. Because Eddie was first and foremost an outdoorsman, and the products he developed were basically working tools for himself and for the customers like himself who spent a lot of time out in the woods and in the backcountry. And those products ranged from salmon lures to fishing flies, to down jackets, to down sleeping bags and tents and packs and all the gear that one uses in the outdoors. This photo here is taken on the Campbell River up in BC in the early mid-1920s. One of his early ads said, "Why would you buy fishing tackle from somebody who doesn't fish?" And so a lot of the early photos that we have of Eddie and his wife are on these various hunting and fishing trips. And he was out in the woods 3 to 5 months of the year, not only because it was his great passion, but because he was promoting the little Bauer sports shop in downtown Seattle. So the culture of Seattle is inextricably linked to the Eddie Bauer brand and to Eddie's life and his personal sensibilities as well. The proximity of the sound and the mountains and the forests and the rivers and streams has influenced, as well as the weather, has influenced the company and really all the great outdoor companies that the Pacific Northwest is home to. Bauer Sports Shop, shown here down on Seneca Street in the late 1920s. You can see the deer hanging on either side of him and lying at the sidewalk at his feet. You wouldn't see that on Seneca Street today, but it was a common sight in front of virtually all the sporting goods stores in Seattle in the 20s. They were hunting and fishing stores primarily, and they actually used to advertise in the Times or in the PI inviting hunters and fishermen to bring their catch or their game in for these displays. And if it was a good display, they give them discounts on store merchandise. And the paper, in the sporting page, sports page of the papers, they'd have articles about who'd been out and where they'd been and what they'd gotten and where it was on display. So it was all the whole symbiotic community relationship of merchant and customer and paper and, you know, everybody involved, and everybody was involved. And so again, that adventure-driven innovation that Eddie was certainly a part of, it was really all about, again, making those working tools that he needed and that his customers demanded. And that outdoor influence infused not only his working life, but his personal life. This is a group photo. Right in the center of the photo, the young lady in the stocking cap and the striped socks is Christine Heltborg. About a year and a half after this picture was taken, she became Christine Bauer. This is where Eddie met his future wife. This is on Bodie Mountain in northeastern Washington. They were at adjoining campsites on Bodie Mountain hunting blue grouse. And so the fact that he met his wife on a hunting trip is certainly apropos. Their first date was actually a fishing trip, again, over on the peninsula the following spring on a cold and drizzly day. And Stein, as she was known, not only didn't complain, but seemed to enjoy herself, which impressed Eddie no end. So he decided that maybe he ought to hang out with her a little bit more. So this is Stein again. Shortly after they were married, Eddie taught her how to shoot trap, and she proceeded to win 8 consecutive Washington State trap shooting championships. So she could handle herself. She could walk the walk and talk the talk with the best of the men. Eddie called her my wilderness companion and claimed she had more stamina than he did in the backcountry. She was also an artist. She loved to travel. She traveled to Asia without Eddie, with some artist friends of hers, and had a great deal of influence, not only on Eddie personally, but she created the first Eddie Bauer women's department in the store. And when Eddie started making the down jackets that made him famous, she insisted there be women's versions of the styles. And in fact, one of Eddie's earliest patented styles was a women's ski jacket that came out in the early 1940s. So what really took the Eddie Bauer brand into another level was his outfitting of mountaineering expeditions. But not all the expeditions he outfitted were mountaineering. There were a number of scientific expeditions in the 50s and 60s that Bauer was involved with. And in fact, the Inca Highway expedition, where this photo is taken from in 1953, was a 2-year archaeological exploration in South America of the 10,000-mile Inca Highway, that the highway system that the Incas had built in the 1500s. An astounding engineering feat. When the Spaniards came and landed and saw this highway that was far superior to anything that they had seen in Europe, they were amazed. And interestingly enough, the Incas did not have the wheel. They had no wheeled transport, so that the way they communicated, they used runners, kind of like the Pony Express without horses. And these runners called chasqui would run relays from Cusco, the capital, all the way as far north as Ecuador, and as far south as deep into Chile. These guys were amazing what they could do in bringing word to and from the Lord High Inca in Cusco. So Eddie provided down sleeping robes, which was, at that time, a sleeping bag was a mummy bag and a sleeping robe was a rectangular cut bag. And so the down sleeping bags and the sleeping cots that you see in the photograph are the part of the gear that Eddie provided for the Inca Highway expedition. Then in 1957, the International Geophysical Year was established. This was a global scientific initiative that ran from July of 1957 through December of 1958. More than 60 countries around the world participated in this. It was an effort to collaboratively gather as much earth science data and knowledge as they could. And they chose this time period, this 18-month period, because of the intense solar activity that was happening during that time period. Now, the International Geophysical Year was very interesting for a couple of reasons. It was during this event that the space race was born. At the very beginning of the year, in October and December of 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 and 2, beating the US into space. And in February of 1958, the US launched Explorer 1. And so these were the first two countries to launch man-made satellites. But from Eddie Bauer's standpoint, the significant part of the International Geophysical Year is that several countries, including the US, sent teams down to Antarctica to study glaciology and to take deep core samplings of the ice to determine meteorological changes over the years and all sorts of extreme data. And among the Americans that went to Antarctica, a team of 18 scientists were the first humans to spend the winter at the South Pole. And they were outfitted with Eddie Bauer down equipment. And it turns out they needed it. During that winter, they registered what at the time was the coldest temperature ever registered on Earth. It was minus 101.2 Fahrenheit. During a 4-day span, when the warmest it got was minus 90. So a bit nippy, and they needed every bit of down protection that they could get. Antarctica continued to be a significant, well, and still is a significant scientific location for scientific endeavors. And this shot here is taken from the mid-1960s to the scientists that were outfitted with Eddie Bauer down gear during their programs they were running again at the South Pole. But the real heart and soul of the what made Eddie Bauer come to be known as the expedition outfitter were the mountaineering expeditions. That really started with big mountain expeditions with this team here, the Third American Karakorum expedition in 1953, who were attempting the first ascent of K2 in Pakistan, the second highest peak in the world. That was the same year the British climbed Everest for the first time. And 3 of the climbers were from Seattle. And so they came to Eddie and asked if he could develop a down parka for them. And so he developed what became known as the Karakorum Parka, named for the mountain range the K2 is part of. And for the next 30 years, the Karakorum Parka was really the cornerstone of the expedition class gear at Bauer, and really became the gold standard of American-made down extreme parkas. This expedition also has a great example of that interconnectedness of seemingly small moments in time that I talked about at the very beginning. The fellow kneeling in the front row on the right here, his name is Pete Shonig. And Pete was one of the Seattle climbers. And when he was packing to leave for Pakistan, one of his friends who was a mountaineer stopped by the house And they were talking as Pete was packing. And in those days, ice axes were wood handled, and usually ash wood. Well, ash is a relatively soft wood and can be prone to shattering on strong duress. And so when Pete's friend saw him with this ash-handled ice axe, he said, "Pete, you're not going to take that piece of crap to K2, are you?" He said, "Listen," he said, I switched out the ash handle of mine with hickory, which is a much harder, stronger wood. He said, "You better take my hickory handled axe with you when you're going to K2." So that's what Pete did. He took his friend's hickory handled ice axe with him. Well, as it turns out, that was one of those pivotal moments in history where if that chance meeting had not happened, history would have unfolded in a much different way, because high on the mountain, when they were 2,500 feet from the summit, they were pinned down in a storm that lasted for 10 days. And while they were trying to wait out the storm, one of the climbers, Art Gilkey, this guy second from the left in the background, developed thrombophlebitis, blood clots in his legs, and he couldn't walk. So rather than try to make the summit, the team voted unanimously to abandon the summit attempt, even though they were within 2 days of making that historic summit. They abandoned the summit in the blizzard and tried to evacuate to get Art off the mountain to save his life. They start down in this blizzard, and at about 24,000 feet, Pete was belaying Gilkey. So his ice axe was flipped into a rock with a rope wrapped around the ice axe, around his hips. And then Gilkey was hanging down on the belay rope. And they had 4 guys on a narrow ledge off to the side with 2 ropes attached to Art, and they were pulling him across this ice slope to this narrow ledge. And while they were doing that maneuver, the last climber, George Bell, started down the ice slope above Pete and slipped on the ice and fell. And he starts tumbling down this steep ice slope. Well, these guys are roped in pairs for safety, and George's rope partner is Tony Strether, one of the 4 guys that's over on that narrow ledge pulling on Art. So as George fell, his climbing rope pulled Tony off his feet, and their climbing ropes tangled with those 2 side ropes they've been pulling Art on, and pulled the 3 other guys off the ledge. So now there are 5 guys falling down the slope, all falling towards the belay rope. And Pete, holding belay, sees all this happening and sees that these 5 guys are falling right towards the belay rope. So he leans into the ice axe to brace himself. And then these 5 guys hit the rope, and all their climbing ropes tangle with the belay rope. The axe handle wasn't ash and it didn't break. Pete didn't lose his grip. The rope didn't break. These guys fell several hundred feet. They're hanging upside down, but Pete was able to hold on and save them from falling several thousand feet off the mountain to their death. It's now called simply the belay. It's one of the most famous saves in mountaineering history. For a number of years, Pete's ice axe, his friend's ice axe, was on display in Tacoma at the museum there. It's now in Colorado at the American Alpine Club Museum. It's kind of like the holy grail of mountaineering artifacts. It's one of the really famous artifacts of mountaineering history. And when the team got back to Seattle, the climbing community embraced them as heroes for having worked so hard to get off the mountain safely. And so when they said about Eddie's jacket, "This is the best mountaineering parka we've ever used," their reputation made Eddie's reputation. And for the next 30 years, virtually every American expedition that went to the Himalaya or the Karakorum or to Antarctica or to the Arctic came to Bauer for their down equipment. An expedition outfitter was the brand mantra. It was sewn into the garment labels. It was on all the catalog pages. It was in all the advertising. And expedition outfitting, mountaineering in particular, became really the main thrust of the premium part of the brand development and product development. And the collaboration that happened between Eddie and the design team and the mountaineers was a continuous back and forth conversation, a symbiotic relationship again, meeting the needs of the climbers, adjusting the placement of the pockets and all sorts, the specifics of the needs, as well as the fabrics and the materials were being used. As an example, this photograph is from 1958, 5 years after that K2 expedition. This is also in the Karakorum Mountains on the summit of Gasherbrum 1, which is the 11th highest peak in the world, one of the 8,000 meter peaks. It's the only 8,000 meter peak that was first summited by an American team in 1958. This is Andy Kaufman on the summit. His summit partner, the guy taking the picture, is Pete Shonig, the guy who made the famous belay on K2 in 1953. From Eddie Bauer's standpoint, the significant thing about this climb, in addition to the historic accomplishment of the climbers, was the fact that that's a Karakorum parka Andy's wearing, but it's different from the original in that this is the first Eddie Bauer parka to use ripstop nylon as the shell fabric. And the way that came about is that I had a phone conversation with Nick Clinch, the expedition leader, several years ago. And Nick described a phone conversation he had with Bill Nemai, Eddie's partner, leading up to the expedition. Nick said, so I called Bill up and told him, he said, we'd love to use your Karakorum parka because several of our team have used it and really love it. He said, but it's heavy. Is there something you can do to make it lighter? And Nick told me, he said, Bill started screaming at me on the phone because Bill was like Eddie, they were hunters and we built these parkas like tanks, of heavy cotton twill because they had unconditional lifetime guarantees on this stuff, so it was built to last, banging around out in the woods by these crazy Northwest hunters. Well, the mountaineers didn't need all that durability, and they certainly didn't need that weight because when you get to above 20,000 feet, every ounce you're carrying is like a pound, and so that they're continually trying to pare down the weight to shave off weight whenever possible because it's life-threatening if you're carrying unnecessary loads at high altitude. So Pete, again, being from Seattle, was in the Eddie Bauer offices a lot, and Pete's background was as a chemical engineer. And he knew that Bauer had been using ripstop nylon in sleeping bags and in the down underwear for a couple of years. And so he convinced Eddie and Bill to try using the ripstop nylon as the shell fabric. They were reticent to do it initially because they were afraid it would be too flimsy. But they convinced them that they were willing to sacrifice some durability for significant savings in weight. So they did it, and it did lighten the jacket to the point that you can't tell on this photograph, but the square quilting that holds the down in the 1958 version are significantly larger squares than were in the 1953 version, so that the jacket held more down. So it was actually lighter in weight and yet warmer than the original. So they were able to break compromise and accomplish two seemingly opposed things, making it lighter and warmer at the same time, simply by listening to their collaborators, the mountaineers, and choosing a different fabric. So the learning process, the design evolution, is a continual learning process for everybody involved. Now, this photo is taken in 1963. This is part of the American Everest expedition in 1963. The two fellows in the forefront, or the one in the middle, is Norman Durnforth, who is the expedition leader, and to his left on the right of the photograph is Barry Prather. And they are wearing what's arguably Eddie's most visionary piece, a piece that in some ways rivals the Skyliner for its revolutionary impact on down outerwear. And the radical thing, this thing was called Style 25 Down Undershirt. So what was radical about this down jacket is it wasn't a jacket at all. It was literally an undershirt. In fact, there were pants that went with it. It were essentially down long johns. It became the mountaineer's favorite piece. It was used on early expeditions all over the world, including this famous expedition in 1963. The occasion of this photograph, by the way, is Durnford's 45th birthday. That's birthday cake they're making. They took 54,000 pounds of equipment with them, including apparently cake mix and cake pans. They had more than 900 porters walking 180 miles from Kathmandu to base camp just to get to the mountain. They were not traveling light. It was not an alpine ascent. This was an all-out assault with 19 climbers and a massive amount of gear. But that ultralight down undershirt was a key part of their equipment. And the significant, I mentioned that it being visionary. The reason we say that is that the down undershirt foreshadowed by 50 years the ultralight layering systems of today. At Bauer, at the North Face, at Patagonia, anybody that makes technical outerwear, technical mountaineering outerwear especially, really builds ultralight layering systems. Now you see a red parka in the background that one of the other team members is using. That was a down parka that was developed specifically for this expedition. It was called the Mount Everest parka. It was the most extreme parka ever in the line. It was rated to -85. Has Wolverine fur on the hood. In talking with Tom Hornbein, one of the summiters from the 63 team, Tom said, you know, you could only, he said the parka was in our packs most of the time. He said you couldn't climb in it. It was too warm to climb in. They'd use it in camp when they weren't moving. And 4 of them, including Hornbein, had to bivouac at 28,000 feet on the descent after summiting. And had they not had that parka, they probably wouldn't have survived the night. So Eddie's orientation was always to make things as warm as physically possible. So it was a radical departure for him in 1957 to introduce this down shirt. It probably made his teeth ache to think of something that lightweight, but it was an amazing piece and has inspired innumerable variations at Bauer over the almost 60 years now since it was first introduced. So now there's another shot showing the Mount Everest parka. This is actually not in Nepal. This is Antarctica again. This is the 1966 American Antarctic expedition that made the first ascent of Mount Vinson, the highest peak in Antarctica. Pete Shonig was part of this expedition too. He's one of the summiters of that team. And you'll see that they're also wearing the down undershirt underneath those parkas. Nick Clinch, who was the expedition leader here, as well as that Karakorum 1 expedition we talked about earlier, said of the parka that there are only 2 places on Earth you could wear that parka, on the summit of Everest or in Antarctica. But if you're in either one of those 2 places, you better have this jacket. So here's a couple of the climbers on the summit of Vinson there in Antarctica in December of 1966. 1978, Eddie Bauer started kind of a new, taking that adventure-driven innovation in an even more targeted direction. Up to that point, the relationship they had with the different mountaineering expeditions in the 50s and 60s and through much of the 70s was fairly informal. As part of the agreement with the expeditions, for providing them with equipment at very nominal cost, or sometimes at no cost. They were given, the company was given rights to use photographs and so forth. And the expeditions were supposed to give feedback on the performance of the product. And they sometimes did, but it was kind of hit and miss. So in 1978, the company wanted to codify that and structure it in a much more specific way. And they wanted to do it in an environment that would they hoped would more closely reflect what the typical customer in Cleveland or in Minneapolis or in Anchorage would encounter. Because the truth is that most people don't climb 20,000 foot peaks. And so the needs of a high mountain, big mountain mountaineers are very specific. And so they felt that ski mountaineering expeditions in the North Arctic would more closely reflect the customer base in the northern United States. So there'd be extreme cold, but not extreme altitudes and so forth. So for a 5-year period from 1978 to 1983, they contracted with a group of Seattle expeditioners, especially two, Steve Trafton and Al Arrington, to field test specific products, not necessarily products that were destined to be produced in production numbers, but this was a period when new fabrics and insulations were coming in. Gore-Tex had first come on the market in 1976 and 77. So waterproof, breathable fabrics were starting to be a real functional reality. The synthetic insulations were starting to come into their own, which had certain advantages in wet climates over down. And so the company wanted to be able to field test these different fabrics and insulation materials and different feature sets, so that when they went to design things, they weren't basing it on theory, but they were basing it on real world, real-time in-field research. So this blueprint here is for obviously a 2-part sleeping bag. And then this was a parka that was developed for that 1978 expedition to Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. So it had a waterproof shell. It had removable, replaceable liners. It had a down liner, a wool liner, and a synthetic liner. And they'd have the team swap out the different insulation materials so they could compare the different insulations in real world usage. So that then again, when the designers and the product developers excuse me, went to develop product, they were choosing materials based on real evidence and not simply on theory. So it was taking that adventure-driven innovation into very specific R&D directions. So this is Baffin Island in 1978. This is the team in their gear. And here they are again, showing, see if I can get it to, there we go. So that's the parka and pants, let's see. Now today, we've taken that, the technology of adventure-driven innovation to yet another level. In 2007, the company made a concerted decision to really get back to the roots of the brand. For the previous 20 to 25 years, from the mid-1980s into the early 2000s, the company had gotten away from expedition outfitting and from really extreme sport outfitting, and had really focused on more casual sportswear, more lifestyle brand orientation. And so a whole generation of Eddie Bauer customers knew Eddie Bauer more for khakis and polos and sweaters and down jackets and Gore-Tex jackets and stuff, but especially for comfortable sportswear. But in 2007, the company decided that they really wanted to get back to the core essence, the brand DNA of what had made the brand an American icon in the first place. And that was mountaineering, expedition outfitting. So what they did in 2007, they brought initially a team of 6 professional mountain guides, world-class guides, to work directly with the product designers in developing a full line of mountaineering gear from base layer to down summit suits. And they spent 18 months developing what was called the first ascent line. And in the spring of 2009, they introduced the line on the market. And 5 of the 6 guides went to Mount Everest as a launching party for the line and climbed Everest. It was called the Return to Everest Expedition. It was the first time Eddie Bauer had been on Mount Everest since the 1980s. They summited the mountain, and unlike in 1963, when they had to wait several days to hear the news that somebody had climbed, the 2009 team had satellite phones and video cameras, and it was practically live streamed all the way to the summit. And so worlds had changed, obviously, in the ensuing years. But the guide involvement with the product development and the guide team is much different than, they're not just technical advisors or brand ambassadors. They work intimately with the product developers. They are intimately involved in selecting the fabrications, the feature sets, the fits. They field test the prototypes all through development. And the guides approve the final product and determine when it's actually ready to go to market. Today, the guide team has expanded to 20. It includes mountain guides, ski guides, snowboard guides, rock climbers, kayakers, a whole array of professional guides and athletes who bring their expertise into the product development field, as well as on expeditions all over the planet. So as part of the guide responsibilities, they meet several times a year for in-depth collaborations where they discuss apparel, gear, packs, sleeping bags, tents, and each of the guides comes with their own sets of experiences and expertises and perspectives, and it can be a real holler fest reaching consensus because these are people that really know their stuff and know that, for example, one of the guides that was on the first, one of the first original 6-man team, one of the first things he said was, "Our clothes are our life support." So that gave a good example of the importance, the motivation they had to get it right, because they know that at 20,000 feet, their lives really do depend on the gear, or whether it's a down jacket or a pack or a tent or anything. And as guides, they're leading clients up these mountains and are responsible for their safety as well. So it's been an invaluable process of having them intimately involved. And one of the clear side effects or benefits of the guide involvement all through the process is that from the beginning, when First Ascent first came to market, many of the pieces have won industry awards, Gear of the Year and Editor's Choice Awards, as a reflection of the quality and performance of the pieces, which has been obviously very gratifying to the company because they did not want to just do this with window dressing and make the pieces look like the real thing. These are working tools, just like in the spirit of the pieces that Eddie was making, working tools for people spending 200 and 300 days of the year at high elevation or all over the world in extreme conditions. Here again, the guides describing or exploring the feature set of a pack in development. And then these are some of the guides as they take those pieces either on prototype tests or just on their regular expeditions when they're using final production pieces. This is Melissa Arnott Reed, one of our alpine climbing guides. She was one of the original 6 guides. She's still with the team. She has summited Everest more than any other non-Sherpani in history. She's the first American woman to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. An amazing climber and a really invaluable asset to the team and product developments here. This is Mason Earl, one of the rock climbing members of the athlete team. I can't tell you where he is, somewhere where I would not go, I can tell you. This is Katie Lambert, another one of the rock climbing athletes on the team. Again, another amazing athlete. It's really a great tribute to the team that it's comprised of both men and women. And these women don't take the backseat to anyone. They can, and their perspective is invaluable in raising the level of the technical gear for women as well. So that Stein Bauer would have been proud of these women. She definitely would not settle for second best when Eddie was first making his down stuff, and these women on the first ascent team are the same. They are not going to settle for second best. This is Drew Tabke, one of the ski athletes on the team, putting the ski gear or the first ascent line to the test. And this is Chris Korbulik, one of our kayakers. In some ways, the kayakers scare me more than the mountaineers. These guys go over 100-foot waterfalls. And God knows what else. But the levels of stress that these guys, both men and women, put the products to the test is a significant part of the Eddie Bauer tradition. Eddie always used to say there can be no compromise of quality when lives depend on performance. And he also said when people saw the Eddie Bauer name, they knew that we had put that equipment to a rugged test. And these folks definitely are doing exactly that. So they are continuing that tradition of adventure-driven innovation that Eddie started himself with his own experience as a guide and with the people that he brought in to work with him, that developed gradually and organically with the working informally with the early mountaineering expeditions that became more formalized in that Arctic series in the 70s and early 80s, and now that has been codified so effectively with the first ascent team. So that is kind of a snapshot view of 100 years of what being outdoors has meant at Eddie Bauer. And you know, it's an interesting thing that how place really informs product in so many ways. And that's certainly true in the outdoor industry. And it's certainly true of Eddie Bauer. Eddie was born on Orcas Island and spent his whole life in the Northwest. His passion for hunting and fishing and for the mountains and forests and rivers and streams was the overriding passion of his life and continues to be the overriding inspiration for us today, just as it is for all the great outdoor companies that call us. So thank you again for listening and for joining with us vicariously and virtually, and open to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. We're getting a lot of comments just about this image that you have up right now. A lot of notes or I can't, or that picture is amazing. And it's pretty incredible that Eddie Bauer, the company, is kind of like adjusted to go from kind of like general mountaineering expeditions, hunting expeditions, and now it looks like since 2007 kind of scooped up some of these other Northwest sports like kayaking, climbing, and kind of adjusting to make sure that they're meeting those adventure needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, again, part of the process of adventure-driven innovation, not determining beforehand which adventure it should be. But when an adventure comes to you and says, I need this, if we don't have it, it's sort of like, and again, a quote from Eddie, he said, if I found I needed something that wasn't available, I made it myself. And so we've tried to continue that entrepreneurial, innovative, nimble approach to things.
Absolutely. So I had a question because you kind of, and actually, do you want to adjust out of stop sharing screen and then we can pull up pictures as we need them so everyone can see with, you have the mountain in the background there. But what is the rest of the story about Eddie and Steen's life? What happened to them?
Well, they were married for 57 years. As I mentioned that they met on Bodie Mountain on a hunting trip. Their first date was a fishing trip the following spring. They were married in February of 1929. Eddie had always said he'd never have a family member work for him in the store, but that was before he married Stein. And she was such a natural. I mean, she was not only a gifted outdoorswoman in her own right, as I said, a champion trap shooter and an avid hunter and fisherwoman, but very gracious and outgoing. She was a darling of the press. She was in the paper a lot, when she was winning all those championships. In fact, in 1934, in December, I think December 8th of 1934, I think it was the PI, she was on the front page. There's a picture of her on skis chopping down a Christmas tree. And it was a story, it was actually an article about the Washington State Christmas tree industry and how it was doing so great. But they had a picture of Mrs. Eddie Bauer cutting down a Christmas tree to promote the story about the Washington State Christmas tree industry. So she was in the paper a lot, and every time Mrs. Eddie Bauer was in the paper, it was free advertising for the store. So Eddie had a gold mine in all sorts of ways with Stein. They traveled or they hunted and fished together. Stein won all those championships until their son was born in 1938 when she retired from competitive shooting. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in February of 1986. She passed away in the first week of April. And Eddie died 15 days later, having not been sick at all. He just faded quickly without his, what he called his wilderness companion. So it was one of those lifetime relationships.
It's so great because I feel like they so exemplify the Pacific Northwest and kind of hearing their story and how they're connected to all of these different individuals that we all know, like Omi Diver and like all of these other people that are kind of big players in the history of the state and outdoor stories and adventures. It's kind of fun to know that Steen was around from the beginning, like women were part of all of this as well, and kind of, at least in this case, an equal partner. We did have someone ask specifically about their son and if he was still involved with the company. Is he still in the area?
He still lives in the area. He lives in Eastern Redmond. He is not involved in the company. In fact, he did work with his father after he graduated from college. But he loves the outdoors. He's a tree farmer, actually. So he loves the outdoors, but in a much different way than his parents. He was not a hunter and fisherman. It was not the outgoing personality that his parents were. He's a very quiet, reclusive. And so in the late 1960s, he made it clear to his father that he did not want to. At that time, Eddie and his son, Eddie Christian, and Bill Nemi, Eddie's partner, and Bill's son, Bill Jr., it was a four-man partnership. And Eddie Christian told his father that he did not want to continue. And so the Bauers sold their interest in the company to the Nemis, who and a few years later sold to General Mills, who sold to Spiegel, and through the corporate series of ownerships over the years. So since 1968, their son has not had any connection with the company officially.
It is interesting to see kind of how involved they were as owners and kind of like working with the company to develop all of these expedition pieces, and like working directly with all these people adventuring, and the company kind of turned away for a little bit, but then like we mentioned in 2007 kind of comes back to build out this partnership directly with the adventurers, like all the different guides and things like that. So it's fun to kind of see that return, and then also kind of include all of those new sports as well. Because that through all of those expeditions, there are other families where you see kind of that generational lineage wearing all of the Eddie Bauer gear on these different like Everest descents and things like that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Being a century-old company, we have generations of customers, and occasionally, in fact, a good number of the pieces in the archives come back to us from customers or from their children or grandchildren. But it's in 2007, when the company did make that shift back to, it really felt like Back to the Future in a way. I mean, it was moving forward into much more into the new technologies of today, but getting back to the really essence of the early roots of the company. And it was interesting to observe the effects in the cultural environment within the company itself, where it was like, it was like suddenly opening all the windows and doorways and letting the fresh air of the outdoors come back into a corporate setting. And just the enthusiasm level, the spirit of the company, the morale just took a huge leap forward. Getting back, feeling like the work that was being done was really being true to yourself instead of simply selling merchandise. So that was a really marked difference, and a good indication, I think, that it was the right decision.
Well, I think that one thing that a lot of people do want to see for sure come back is that down long johns. There's a lot of chatter about like, why don't we all have those right now? So if you can let the guides know that they need to put something in about that, I think we have a lot of people that would be pretty happy with that. And speaking of kind of like the Back to the Future and all of this, I love that image of looking out on that storefront that you said was on Seneca Street. Was that, someone had asked if that was on 2nd and Seneca, and was that the original store?
It was, that picture is on Seneca between 2nd and 3rd. It was actually, that was his first location when he first opened in 1920 was also on Seneca between 2nd and 3rd, but he was renting space inside another man's gun shop for the first year and a half or so, until he had saved up enough money to have his own storefront. And he moved down the street a couple of doors to 211 Seneca, which was a very tiny little shop. And the store that you saw the picture where the deer are framing the door, that's at 18 Seneca, I think it was, just on the other side of the alley. He was working his way down the street to gradually bigger places. Now the question about Second and Seneca, he did have a store, in 1934, he moved to what is now, it's called the Medical Arts Building. It's still standing, actually. I think there's a Starbucks in the ground floor now. It was on the southwest corner of Second and Seneca. And he moved into that building in 1934. And that was a much larger space. And then in the late 40s, or early 40s, excuse me, he moved to the Washington Athletic Club building, actually. Was there until 1951 when he and his partners sold the store business to Frederick and Nelson. For those in Seattle who know Freddy's and the department store business. He sold the retail business to Frederick and Nelson, and they operated just mail order for almost 20 years.
Oh, that's amazing. I didn't realize that they only operated mail order.
They had a little factory showroom, but they didn't have an actual store until 1971.
I love how just painfully, like Northwest, all of that, it's just so many of the things that you said, but then also like a Starbucks in the bottom of the building, that doesn't help triangulate anything. That could be anywhere in Seattle at this point. But yeah, Frederick and Nelson and all these great kind of Pacific Northwest mainstays. Someone else had asked about, and I'm so excited to hear your response to this, something about badminton and the relationship with the company, and that was from Liza.
Yeah, Eddie's first two patents actually were for a badminton shuttlecock that he developed in the a year or two before he developed the down jacket. Actually, his sojourn with feathers and down was sort of a circuitous path. It really started in the mid-20s with his first side business was called Eddie Bauer Tackle Makers. Which was a group of women tying fishing flies from home, and he would sell them wholesale. And one of the materials he provided them was with feathers. And so that's how he first started working with the fancy feather merchants that got him educated in fancy feathers and down and so forth. And then in the early 30s, a group of Seattle tennis players had come to him and they wanted to form a badminton club, but they were having a hard time getting the shuttlecocks because at that time there was a tariff on feathered products, and the shuttlecocks were handmade in Europe using real feathers, plastic like you see today and stuff. And so it cost more than $7 a dozen to bring the shuttlecocks into the States, this is during the Depression, of course, which is prohibitively expensive. So badminton was actually considered a rich person's game. It was played on the East Coast some among the wealthy, but really hadn't come to the West Coast at all. So this Seattle Tennis Club group was really kind of ahead of their time. And so they were asking Eddie if he could help them get the shuttlecocks. So Eddie used to do a lot of hunting up in Canada. And so on one of his hunting trips, he bought a case of the British shuttlecocks up there and brought them home, and he sold most of them to this group of tennis players for their badminton club. But he kept some of them because he figured if he could figure out how they were made and could make them locally, he could substantially reduce the cost. And if he could do that and make it economically viable, it would be a great game to promote because you can play it at a novice level recreationally, but you can play it at a highly professional level too. So he takes them apart, and having had us for several years now, had a relationship with the feather merchants because of his fishing flies. He had access to high quality goose feathers, and to balance the weight, it has a cork base. And so what he did is he drilled holes in the cork and took beads of birdshot from his shotguns and dropped these beads of birdshot in so he could control the weight grain by grain. So he could custom weight each of these birdies so that then if you have 100 shuttlecocks, they're all going to perform uniformly so that you know about how far they're going to fly and what directions, because otherwise it's like a dandelion puff, that'll just go anywhere or nowhere. And so he he patented his design for a shuttlecock and his method of weighting them, and formed another side business, Bauer Shuttles, and started manufacturing shuttlecocks upstairs from his store. Now I didn't include, we have a photograph of the little shuttlecock operation where there's a huge table with women sitting around making these shuttlecocks by hand. I have in my office one of the scales they use to measure the weight of these things. And by the end of the 30s, Bauer shuttles were being used in national tournaments. So, I mean, it was the first Bauer product to reach a national audience, even though on a small scale in a niche market. And it was a relatively, I mean, it was a small but successful part of the business until the war World War II broke out, when, at which time the government froze the commercial use of feathers and down. And so not only did that shut down his shuttlecock business, it shut down really most of his down outerwear and sleeping bag trade. So he had to develop a down alternative and so forth during the war years. But yeah, the badminton shuttlecock is an interesting element of that story.
Well, what's so great about it is how responsive he is to what people come to him and ask him for. I mean, I think that's what that illustrates. It's like, well, we need things that are going to perform really well on Everest and Antarctica, but also we need this shuttlecock.
Again, it's not for us to determine what the adventure is. You know,
Yeah.
This person comes and says, "I have this." Our adventure is establishing a badminton club. You know,
a very local adventure, but
yeah,
still
right.
Very important. Absolutely. And you're kind of mentioning how you oversee the archives. Can you tell us like what you actually maintain in those archives, what you would see if we got to come visit? What are some of the most interesting things you have in there?
Well, on permanent display, of course we have the Skyliner. We have the World War II flight suit that he developed for the U.S. Army Air Forces. We have Pete Shonig's K2 Karakorum parka that's on loan to us from the Shonig family. And a number of other historic pieces like that. The archive, we have roughly 1,000 garments, a little over 400 of which are down products of some sort or another. It ranged from the down parkas and ski parkas and to down bathrobes and down face masks and down booties and down mittens. And if it attaches to the body in some sort of way, Eddie Bauer's done it in goose down at some point or another. The down face mask is a scary thing to behold. So I don't know if people are going to be dealing with COVID in deep, severe cold winter, but we have 2 face masks in the archive right now that would definitely, but come to think of it, it doesn't cover the mouth, so it wouldn't do us any good for the COVID functionality.
Not ideal in that case, yes. You had mentioned like one of your favorite items when we were chatting before the program. Do you want to describe that favorite Eddie Bauer item that you know of that's kind of like an older item?
Well, there are a number of pieces, you know, and sometimes it's hard to choose, but one of my favorite pieces is a 1948 Forester shirt that has an Eddie Bauer label, but all evidence points to the probability that Filson made it for Eddie Bauer and it was branded Eddie Bauer. It's made of an ultra lightweight wool, beautiful high thread count wool fabric that drapes really beautifully, really finely stitched. And now it's a Forester shirt. It's an outdoorsman's woodman shirt, but it beautifully made, pocketing with pockets for shells and so forth. One of the interesting things is that it has a back pocket. It looks almost like a game bag, but it's not a hunting jacket and it's not lined, you know, for that like a game bag would be. It's intended, in the old catalogs describe it, it really is intended for a jacket or your lunch or something like that. It's essentially, the shirt is essentially like a backpack in a wool shirt because you could put a first aid kit and and some snacks and a lightweight down jacket in that shirt back pocket. And yet when it's empty, because of the wool fabric and the way the pocket is cut, it lies perfectly flat and flowing so that it doesn't look odd or bulky at all. So the ingenious combination of an ingenious design, really fine craftsmanship, and this beautiful fabric is, it's really a great example of functional art, you know, where it's really built for high functionality and rugged outdoors, and yet done with really exquisite fine detail.
Well, and that really fine wool is making a comeback in all sorts of athletic wear. You're kind of seeing like those materials really get innovated currently.
Yeah, it's interesting. Wool, of course, was the technical fabric of Eddie's day. You know, in the catalog, you don't see woven shirts that are not wool until in the catalog until almost the 80s and stuff like that. You know, other than like safari wear and stuff like that. And so it was used extensively, and now it's come, you know, I mean, especially the, you know, merino wools and stuff like that are real lightweight and soft and, you know, not scratchy at all, and have natural odor resistance and moisture resistance. And I mean, it has a lot of great natural and breathability and so forth. So yeah, it's great to see a natural fiber like especially merino wool coming back into its own and be appreciated and being taken into new directions with it's interesting as fabric technology evolves and the design thinking evolves, where the product developers get more and more creative about how to use these new tools and combining new techniques and new fabrics, the amazing things to see what they can do.
Absolutely. And kind of speaking in those lines, and we were talking about how place really informs the product, and you know, how the Pacific Northwest just kind of was the birthplace for all of these different companies that equipped the world essentially in all of these ways. And something that someone asked, and I think this kind of relates to sensibilities of the Pacific Northwest and being interested in like environmentalism, and so many of the Eddie Bauer products that were kind of like the flagship mainstays were down. What about the sustainability of down? And is Eddie Bauer working on anything related to that?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we work in collaboration with, or we use what's called responsible RDS down, responsible down standard down, where it's a consortium of different companies that agree to follow a standard of certain things like no live plucking of birds, where the animals, the birds that are raised for the down are they're slaughtered before the down is harvested. The meat is used in the food industry and so forth, so that it's sustainably used in that way. The raising of the birds is very specific, where they have to be treated humanely all through the life cycle process. And that's really important to Eddie Bauer and to all the companies that sign on to using RDS down. So that's something that people should look for when they're considering buying down products, looking for the label that indicates responsible down, standard down.
Absolutely. And I love that as we talk about innovation with all of these Pacific Northwest companies, it's kind of these innovations now that are focused on ethical, moral choices, as well as being as inclusive as possible, which it's interesting to see some of those things happening earlier on in some of the Pacific Northwest companies.
In addition to RDS, we also work with an organization called Blue Sign, where they certify that and this has more to do with fabrications, so that the processes used in developing especially the synthetic fabrics, are sustainable, so that it minimizes the energy use, the water use, so that it's not overly consumptive of natural resources in the production of the fabrics. The company also, in terms of sustainability and the humane treatment of not only the animals involved, but people involved, since almost all clothing manufacture is done overseas anymore. We have these specific trade requirements for the factories that we work with, to ensure that the people working in the factories are treated and paid fairly and humanely. And all of that is part of the sustainability commitments that the company has.
Excellent. Well, we've run to the end of our time, but thank you so much. And I'm so excited to see what all of these guys innovate with all of the Eddie Bauer staff next. And I know that one of my favorite things to take with me on outdoor adventures right now is my little insulated Eddie Bauer mug as I wear my first descent fleece, nice and cozy in the morning with my cup of that Pacific Northwest, roasted coffee, just painfully Pacific Northwest. But thank you so much for joining us. And I do want to take a moment to also plug the fact that the company is celebrating 100 years. And so there are also other upcoming events and programs that you're hosting. I noticed on social media, all of the sharing started off for this coming Saturday, I believe, where it's encouraging people to go outdoors and spend the night outside and look up at the stars. So all sorts of fun things coming out from Eddie Bauer this year. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us and share a little bit about the company.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
And for all of you out there, let's see if I can share my screen for our final conclusion. Thank you all so much for joining us again for this installment of the Virtual History Pub. We were thrilled to have you back. And be sure to continue checking our website and all of our social media pages for our upcoming Washington State Home Society virtual programs. You can follow the link that's included right there that takes you to our website so you can see all of those events right there. Follow us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and then also consider donating so that we can continue bringing you this programming. And that link is right there as well. You can make a little note on there saying that you came to Virtual History Pub and you love learning about Eddie Bauer and outdoors adventures. And then also just consider joining as a member. So you're connected to our organization, getting things like Columbia Magazine, exclusive invites to member programming, getting updates, and just knowing that you're supporting the Historical Society. So thank you so much for joining us, and we really look forward to seeing you next time. So take care and